Professor Wergeles here. We are on lecture number 30. We're talking about closures. I've given you this example where I have a function called cow, and I have a function called moo inside a cow. I'm returning moo, and I'm wondering what it's going to print. So save the code, upload it to the server, and let's run the code and see what happens. So I'm going to go back on the browser. We're going to go to number 5, closures.html. You're not going to see anything. You need to right-click on the browser, do an inspect, open up the developer tools, and then go into the console. So here you're going to see I'm printing out the function, and here is the print statement. It says Bertha says moo. So the answer to the question is name is also included with the function called moo. They're both included, and name is within the scope. But why? Okay, if I open up the function moo, and I open up scopes, you're going to see cow is a closure, therefore name is included with that closure. Now, what does a closure mean? You're going to want to know this for an exam. I'm just going to go to the web and search JavaScript closures, and let's pull up W3 Schools. Now, before you can understand a closure, there's a few things that you need to understand. We've talked about local and global scope, but let's go over this so we can see exactly what the difference is and how global variables can be made local with closures. So if I have a function here, I can access A with inside the function. This is going to be a local variable. If I have another function and there's a variable called A outside the function, I have access to A inside the function. Now A here is going to be a global variable. Remember, local variables can only be used with inside the function, and it's hidden from other functions and other scripting code outside of the function. In addition, remember, global and local variables with the same name are actually different variables. Modifying one does not modify the other. We also need to talk about a variable's lifetime. Global variables live as long as your application lives. So as long as the web page is open, the global variable will be there. However, with local variables, once the function is invoked and finished running, the variable is then deleted when the function is finished. So let's say I have an example here. Okay, so I want to have a function called add. I want to increment the counter by 1, and I want to be able to only increment the counter with the add function. Well, here's an example. I have the function add. I can increment the counter. However, counter is a global variable, so I can access this variable in other functions. Okay, so here I have a variable for counting something, and I want this counter to be available to all functions. I could use a global variable and a function to increase the counter just like this, but the problem is any code on the page can change counter without calling add, because counter is the global variable. So how can I fix this? Well, I could change the counter variable to a local variable. I call add, counter is equal to 0, I increment by 1. But the problem with this is if I call add 3 times, the result will be 0 each time. Because remember, a local and global variable with the same name are going to be different variables. So here I call add, counter is equal to 0, I add 1, and then counter is destroyed. I call add again, counter is equal to 0, I add 1, counter is destroyed, and so on. So counter will be equal to 0 here because the local and global variables are different even though they have the same name. So how can I fix this? Well, what I could do here is put the variable inside the function add and only have it as a local variable, and then I could return the counter variable. Okay, so I call add, counter is equal to 0, I increment by 1, I return that. So that's going to be 1. I call add again, counter is equal to 0, I add 1, I return 1. So it's instead of being 2, it's still 1 because counter is going to be set to 0 every time the function has been run. Every time the function has been executed. If I call it a third time, counter is still equal to 0, add 1, return 1. So even though I call add 3 times, I'm still only returning 1. The way to solve this is to have an inner function in JavaScript, or a nested function, which then creates a closure. All functions have access to global scope. In JavaScript, all functions have access to the scope above them. JavaScript supports nested functions. Nested functions have access to the scope above them. So here's an example to fix the solution. Inside the function, I have a variable called counter that's equal to 0. Then I have a plus function, which is an inner function that increments counter to 1. I call plus, I return counter. Okay, so if I call add 3 times, what will the solution be? Okay, this could solve the counter dilemma, but we want to be able to reach plus from outside the function. I don't want to have to call it inside the function like this. It's kind of weird. So that's why a closure is needed to solve all of these issues. Here's the solution. I have a function called add. It has a counter, and then I return counter plus 1 with the counter variable. Okay, so if I call add 3 times, the value will now be 3 because I have a closure. A closure is a function having access to the parent scope even after the parent function has closed. Okay, a closure makes it possible for a function to have private variables. And it is similar to object-oriented programming. If I come back here and search JavaScript closures again, there's another good article by Mozilla. Okay, it's the first link here. And in order to understand how closures work, you need to know what lexical scoping is. The example of lexical scoping describes how a parser resolves variable names when functions are nested. The word lexical refers to the fact that lexical scoping uses the location where a variable is declared within the source code to determine where that variable is available. Nested functions have access to the variables declared in their outer scope before that function. And that's exactly what our closure looks like as well. We have a function called moo, and moo has access to the variables in the outer scope or above that function. You can think of it as object-oriented programming. If you take in 3330, you can think of cow as being a class. And inside the class, I have a variable called name and a function called moo. And when I return moo, I'm returning the entire class, essentially. Remember, a closure is the combination of a function and the lexical environment within which that function was declared. This environment consists of any local variables that were in the scope at the time the closure was created. Now, what's the purpose of closures? They have a good article here on the practical cases for closures. Closures are useful because they let you associate some data, this is a lexical environment, with a function that operates on that data. This has obvious parallels to object-oriented programming, where objects allow us to associate some data, the object's properties, with one or more methods. Okay, and that's the purpose of a closure. It's an object, it's a class where I can associate a method with a variable, but do not allow any other methods to access that variable. So it's almost like a private variable for that specific function. Now they have a good example of why you'd want to use a closure and updating the front end. So I recommend you read both of these articles. They're very important for you to understand what a closure is, how it works, and what's the purpose of a closure. Now let's come back to our example. On the test, you're going to see something similar to this. I'm going to give you a closure, and I'm going to ask you whether name is accessible or not. You'll see in some of the other examples, it doesn't necessarily need to be a function expression. Okay, it can be a function expression inside, or it can even be a function declaration inside. The important part for a closure is that it's a nested function. I'm going to write down some notes. They're going to help you for an exam. We're going to do this in the next video. Stick with Professor Wergeles, and we'll see you in the next video.